Recently, I sat down with Nick Matthews of CultureAmp for a conversation around company culture, and particularly in this post-COVID world we now inhabit. We had a really interesting conversation, particularly around how culture relates to your brand promise, and how building a series of values that are well articulated and actionable is actually the scaffolding that sustains company culture. And of course, a conversation these days wouldn't be complete without a reference to how culture relates to remote work. I hope you enjoy it. So, Nick, thanks for joining me. Before we get started, love to hear a little bit about yourself and tell me about CultureAmp.
Yeah, great. Thanks to be here. So my name's Nick Matthews. I'm the Vice President and General Manager of CultureAmp over here in Europe. I've been with CultureAmp now for just over 4 years. And we've built what is our kind of fourth office. So obviously CultureAmp is an Australian business with a huge presence in North America. But again, over the last 4 years, we now have quite a kind of considerable presence in Europe, as people and culture has become a real hot topic and differentiator for businesses, whether that be in the UK or across Europe.
Yeah, beautiful. So I guess my first big question is, what is culture? Can you define it?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's, obviously it's our name. And I think it's a word that people have a sense of what it is, but can often be misunderstood. And especially when it's banded around within organizations, talked about by leadership, or maybe discussed at an executive or board level. And I think one of the challenges is that historically, culture has been something that certain functions or roles have probably switched off and have thought it's not important, or it's a nice to have. So whether that be a CFO or COO type role, would say culture is great, but actually what matters more is our business model, our go-to-market strategy, our profit and loss, all of those things. And in some respects, that was probably kind of correct. I think over the last 50 years or so, that has what made a lot of companies successful, is their business models, their kind of the way they've gone to market. But I think increasingly the world has changed. And we like to say that brand is a promise to your customer, and culture is actually how you deliver on it. And I think in a world where the way that people are made to feel by organizations is so important, whether that be online, in person, and truly your employees are the individuals that are going to make a customer feel a certain way. And it better match up to the brand promise that you've put out there with all of your expensive marketing and things like that. And so you can see this happening. You can see some real winners starting to show, organizations that have that true connection between their brand promise and then their culture. But I still think that there is a misunderstanding of what kind of culture is. And I when I speak to organizations, my explanation is saying that culture is a tagline that people understand, but it's your values that actually define that. Your values and your behaviors is how you actually define at a granular level what culture is. And for me, values are so important, because they are what people do in the hard times. They are what people do when they have the hard decisions, or when they're alone and they're not being told what to do. That's how they're going to act. So it's the kind of scaffolding for an organization, how they do that.
Yeah, I love those differentiations, because I know as my role as someone who's often working alone, being able to look to the values either on the wall, maybe they're not on the wall, but be able to have that kind of North Star is just super important. So is it more than about defining the values and letting culture come from that? Or do you think organizations can define culture separately?
I think people often ask the practical questions of, how do I define and create my culture? And the simple answer is that you already have one, whether you know it or not, or whether you like it or not, or whether it's intentional or not. You have a culture. So the question is saying, how do I either double down and grow and expand the penetration of that culture across our organization, or how do we maybe start to move in a new direction because either the situation or as a company we've decided we need to focus on this. And so when those kind of questions come up, culture is really is an outcome, I think. It's like engagement is an outcome. You can't necessarily control it. You can't say be more engaged or like our culture more. You have to have a number of levers, and the levers that you pull specifically with regards to culture is your values and behaviors. And so that's why if you're going to have an exercise or you're going to have a piece of work or an initiative or a program, defining those values and behaviors is super important. And the second piece of advice we tend to give is that your values are probably already there. You should spend most of the time trying to uncover them and define them and articulate them in a way that they become practical and easy for people to use, follow, or seek advice from when they're in those hard situations.
Yeah. What does a practical value look like? Because I think of a lot of businesses I've been into that have respect and integrity and things like that, which is sort of just part and parcel of being a decent human being. But what are some of maybe the better examples you've seen or better ways that organizations have gone about defining a really good quality value that people can look to?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to answer that. One is, okay, I'll talk through maybe an example of some of the culture and values because we've been very intentional around those. But secondly is, I can then talk about it's the reinforcement and what that means and what that means if you're a leader, if that means if you're a manager, what it means in these times. So one of our values is at Culture Amp, and we have 4 values, is trust people to make decisions. Now, that's very, very helpful for people, but it does require some kind of explanation and some sort of detail below it. So you'll notice it's not just one word, like decisions or respect or honesty. It's a kind of I guess a phrase, an instruction. So trust people to make decisions. And when I explain this to people and I explain all of our values and help people onboard into the organization, I focus a lot on helping them understand, what is a good use of that value and what is the sort of a bad use or the wrong use. So it's like the golden side of values is a whole sort of debate around it. So trust people to make decisions. What it's not is saying, I get to make the decision and everybody else has to agree with me, which can be that people can interpret. For me, it's trust people to make decisions is then immediately followed by the question that you should ask yourself, which is, whose decision is it? And so if we go back to that scaffolding, that framework of what is culture, if you had an organization of, 10,000 people and you had this value installed, one of the things it would help would be that rather than 10,000 people saying, okay, I'm just going to go off and do my own thing, if 10,000 people said before they did something is this my decision or is this someone else's decision? That would very much move an organization in a certain way and create a way of operating. So they're very, very practical instruction manuals. And I touched on it before. The second part of what I was going to say is you have to train and onboard people into these, and you have to reinforce. You can't just put them on the wall and say they're there. There is definitely a piece of work to uncover and define and articulate and then communicate. That's one piece of work, and that happens time boxed. And then you can spend the next 10, 20 years reinforcing, onboarding, training, highlighting, continually educating people. So it becomes very, very intentional around this. So when people say, what is culture and how can you be very intentional about it? It is very much that. It has to be something that is clearly defined and articulated and reinforced in the same way that people spend a lot of time and energy on things such as, regulatory requirements, anti-money laundering training, unconscious bias. Those things have become very, very intentional with programs, with communications, and people understand that they're important. The same amount of effort, if not more, frankly, has to come in. And I would say that we're very lucky in that our CEO and co-founders wanted to build a culture first company. So values were the very beginning, even before our business plan, but it doesn't mean that you can have a business plan, or if you're pivoting or if you're tweaking now in a post-COVID world, that you can't say this is now going to be something that's important to us as we go through.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, one of the things as an outsider looking in, whenever I sort of have attended a Culture Amp event or seen, the team on social media, you guys are constantly calling out when someone's living a value, right? Like courage to be vulnerable, I think is one. Like I see that all the time, whether someone presents or shares something on platforms like LinkedIn. So is that an example of that sort of that's embedded in the culture and
Yeah,
part of the day to day? Let's keep talking about it.
totally. And again, it's easy to say that's like reinforcement, both publicly and internally.
Yeah.
And I think it's great that your value should be both internal and external. But what you also happen in that scenario is that the reason why we created the courage to be vulnerable is that we fundamentally believe that in today's fast-moving, constantly changing world, no one has all the answers. People are going to make mistakes. People are going to fail, and we want them to kind of fail fast. And rather than saying fail fast or I mean, there's the famous kind of Facebook one, which was move fast and break things, and all these kind of things. People read into those values and take them as kind of mantras of how you operate. So, courage to be vulnerable is really saying the first part of that journey is to admit that you were wrong, or that you made a mistake, or that you weren't comfortable doing something but you did it anyway, and that's why we pitched it in that way, which is it's a very much bringing that honesty and bringing that vulnerability into the workplace is how we've intentionally decided to create that energy around it's okay to try things, and it's okay to fail, and it's okay to move forward from that. But the important thing is learning, and you can only learn if you admit that you're wrong. So that's where it all comes back to that courage to be vulnerable.
Yeah, beautiful. And my last question, we're obviously chatting now remotely because we're 8 or 9 weeks into lockdown in the UK. Have you made any material difference to how you're operating in terms of some of these values while the team are all remote? Has it forced you to be a little bit more intentional maybe, or how have you continued to bring these to the surface?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's what everyone is talking about. My first observation is to be that this is not remote working. This is surviving a global pandemic at home. People have been remote working for years. We've had a number of people work remotely at Culture Amp, both here in the UK and also globally, and it's never been a kind of a challenge or an opportunity. It's just been part of how we work. I think where we are now is to say, okay, this global pandemic has really shown a couple of things. One, there is no technical reason now why people cannot work more flexibly.
Absolutely.
And if you follow that thread through, that means it has the potential to increase diversity and inclusion, because people that don't necessarily live in London or can't commute easily to London, folks that maybe have physical disabilities that don't allow them to get into London or get on a train every day and commute, people that have childcare or families or a non-traditional 9-to-5 availability can now kind of work in this way. So I do think it's going to level the playing field around being able to slightly move the needle around increasing in diversity and inclusion in the workplace, because saying you can't work remote is no longer a valid argument.
It's been proven wrong
from
definitively.
organizations. Technology has improved. I think what this has done is it's given companies the sort of the real shock to try this stuff out and realize that they can do that. That being said, working from home 8 hours on a laptop is very different to being in an office for a number of human reasons: social interaction, micro breaks, micro interactions, human contact. And so I think the jury is still out in terms of what is the optimum sort of work from home remote experience. But there's enough people doing it now, so we'll probably find out. But I think for us, two things is we're seeing. One is it's probably from now onwards that you're going to understand and see those organizations that have cultures and values and behaviors that will support a long-term shift to this new whatever the new normal is, because they will have built the flexibility into their kind of their culture and behaviors to allow them to adapt, versus those organizations that use the office and use close hierarchical management structures, who use micromanagement or elements of kind of control to manage the business. That's going to be a real shift for those organizations. I can only imagine that I've spoken to customers that are saying, hey, our performance management process is based around managers being sat next to their teams 5 days a week and understanding what they're achieving, what their outcomes are, how they're performing, and now having to do a pay and remuneration conversation based on none of that visibility being there. So how do we make sure that we remove or reduce bias? How do we make sure there's an equitable outcome for people? It's going to require some real big shifts for a large number of organizations. And I think the final kind of point to that is, we're very lucky. You and I are very lucky that we work for organizations where we can just work remotely. We have the tools, we have the technology, we have values and behaviors that allow us to kind of operate. I think that the big shift has been, there will be a number of traditional organizations and industries that have looked at human capital as a number of people on a spreadsheet, or a set number of outcomes based on inputs. And I think this will have woken them up to the fact that engagement, culture, mentoring, diversity, inclusion, they can't ignore it anymore. It's become very, very real through the very human crisis that this pandemic has been. And so I'm very optimistic that this will, there'll be some tweaks at the more sort of startup-y, fast-moving, agile businesses end, where this is just another direction they're going to go in. But I think the big tectonic shift is going to be those larger, more traditional organizations that have no choice now but to up level and really embrace some of this kind of new way of thinking and new operating models.
Yeah, sounds like potentially becoming a bit more values-led, if we think that earlier point.
Yeah, I think really looking at their people and culture strategy much more in a much more nuanced way, and understanding how it's going to, again, going back to that, I had an example at the weekend where I went to a garden centre. It was the highlight of my weekend, a chance to go out and stretch my legs and see some people. And I turned up, and they were actually closing because the line was too long to allow more people in to go through all the process and the delays that were now incurred by all of the additional measures. And the lady came up to me with a mask on, wound down the window of the car, and she said, "I'm sorry, we've actually closed the line now. You have to kind of go away." And I said, "Oh, okay, totally understand. It's a shame. I thought I'd come late in the day when it'd be less busy." And she said, "Oh, what were you looking for?" I said, "Oh, I just wanted to get some gas for my barbecue." And she said, "Oh, okay, that's actually very, very different. There's a separate station for that. Why don't you park up and I'll walk you around and you can go and do that?" And I was delighted. I had a fantastic customer experience, because in that moment, that employee made that decision that they could help me and provide great customer service. And I went and did that, walked out and did it all. And I came away thinking, there's obviously a set of behaviors and values and culture at that organization that has led that lady to feel empowered to make that decision and provide great service. And I then walk away as a customer saying, I'm impressed by that brand. I'm impressed by that interaction. I will probably go back there. I will maybe spend more money there and have a positive experience from doing that. And it didn't come from, how nice the branding was, how good their, new setup post-COVID was. It was down to that human interaction. So I think we're going to start to see more and more examples of this as we go forward, where consumers are going to make a choice around who they are going to spend their time and money and attention with, based on how they are made to feel. And that doesn't come from business plans and operating models. That comes from human interaction. So it's a little story that really brought it home to me of why I think, if you're in HR, if you're in people, it's an exciting time, because I think that CEOs, COOs, CFOs, boards, executive teams, shareholders are much more alive to why this is important. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you very much, Nick. If people want to connect with you or check out Culture Amp, where can they go?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So cultureamp.com around the product, around people and culture, so engagement and performance. Secondly is we have culturefirst.com. Culture First is our community, and we have a whole load of materials up there around resilience, both organizational and sort of personal resilience. And that's free. There's lots of free resources there. You don't have to be a customer of Culture Amp. You can go and kind of join the community there. And then you can find me on all the usual social channels, so LinkedIn and Twitter. And yeah, happy to kind of connect with anyone. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to chat.